Thank you for being here for the discussion session on J.C. Beall's new book, The Contradictory Christ. This is going to be an authors meet the critics type of session. So we are going to have 30 minutes each speaker, which is going to include Axel, Arturo Barceló, Aspeitia, Luis Estrada González, and myself, to give some comments and some concerns about the book. And then JC will have another 30 minutes to talk about the comments and try to defend his position. And at the end, we are going to devote other 30 minutes to a Q&A session with the public. So if you have any comments, I think you can write in the chat. If you have any problems, you can also send me an email. You received the link through my email, or you can send me a message here. That said, let me introduce the first critic, which is going to be Axel Arturo Barceló. Axel is a Mexican researcher at the Institute for Philosophical Research at UNAM. And he works on logic, but also in other many areas of analytic philosophy. He does epistemology, he does a bit of philosophy of cognitive sciences, a bit of aesthetics, and so on and so forth. You choose an area, he's going to be able to speak about it. And so, Axel, as I said, you're going to have 30 minutes. I'm going to let you know when you have spoken for 20, so you can check out that you still have 10. And the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Please turn off your mics and, listen to Axel. Thank you, Axel.
No, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Luis. And of course, Beall, for inviting me to partake in this wonderful session. It looks like it's going to be great fun. A lot of good philosophy is going to be done in the next couple of hours. I'm going to start by sharing my presentation and I hope you can still see me. Yeah. Okay, so Beall wrote this wonderful book. And even though it's about Christ, I'm not going to talk a lot about Christ himself. Also because I hope not to say anything sacrilegious. That would be great because I'm a Christian myself, so that would be bad. Okay, but what I'm going to do is because the book is mostly about how to deal with paradox or with apparent contradiction, right? And it's mostly just about this way of framing certain problems in philosophy, like trying to why we try to avoid contradictions, why we even talk about things like apparent contradictions as like something bad that is lurking in the shadows and that we have to avoid at all costs. And that is the main point of the book, right? To say that sometimes that is just the wrong attitude to take. That is just, or at least it's an attitude that is question begging against a dialectist answer, where, well, there's a contradiction there. That's something we can learn. We can learn that there are contradictions. And so this shouldn't be something that we try to avoid from the start, right? Like there's this natural attitude to think that to accept contradictions must be like the very, 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 very last resort, right? You just avoid at all costs, right? This is something that even Wittgenstein had already written about, how it just doesn't seem to, even though this is something that a lot of philosophers think and something that guides a lot of philosophy making. This is a presupposition that hasn't been properly evaluated, right? It's just assumed and it's just been permeating Western philosophy for centuries and centuries. But Beall knows that, of course, through all these centuries, whenever we face something akin to an apparent contradiction, philosophers that are, we are a crafty bunch, and we have created a lot of strategies to avoid contradictions, right? To tame contradictions or turn them into non-contradictions, right? Pluralism being the most best known, but there are others, right? And so what Beall does in the book is try to argue against these other kinds of explanation. In the particular case of the immutability of Christ, even though, as I say, even though this is the case study, the morals are more general, right? So we have contradictory evidence, or at least evidence for propositions that are prima facie contradictory regarding Christ. And the question is, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to accept that, well, Christ is a contradictory being, or are we going to have to do something, tinkle a little bit with the evidence and with how the results of the evidence are presented in order to rescue contradiction? Of course, Beall is going to argue that there is no need to tinkle too much with what we know about Christ, but it could be applied to any other paradox. Well, not to any, but it's broad enough. And he gives in his book two kinds of arguments against other strategies to try to make sense of the contradiction between, at least apparent contradiction, between recognizing that Christ is immutable as he's God, as the divine entity, he's immutable, but also, as you know, he was incarnated and suffered at the cross, and all these things happened that seemed like changed him, right? He seemed to have endured some changes, and therefore it seems, at least prima facie, that he is not, he changed, right? He's not immutable. So there's, I'm sorry, just that damn fly. I don't know, the rest of the people didn't hear about it, but there's a fly that has been bothering me for minutes. Okay, so so we have very good evidence that we want to respect in favor of a proposition that Christ is immutable, and it's contradictory proposition that he's not immutable, right? So what are we going to do? Beall wants to, he does a lot of very good work making sense of what it would mean to say that Christ is a contradictory entity, why there is not a lot of problem there. But then he also has spent a big chunk of the book trying to argue against other proposals to make sense of this apparent contradiction, and to show that it's not a real contradiction. There's no real contradiction there. And he gives two kinds of arguments against these positions. On the one hand, that it is a general argument that it's just unmotivated. I mean, there's no reason to even try it. I mean, because we can just accept the contradiction. And then particular criticism he has against particular ways of caching this idea. Most of the arguments are of the general kind, and this is something he goes again and again in the book, because I think it's a very central point in his proposal. For example, he says, there's nothing whatsoever wrong with finding the true metaphysics. That project should continue. But to stake the truth of Christ on such projects, at least when, and this is the key part, the problem has a ready and simple solution, appears to stake too much. Again, where there's some very good reason to reject the simpler contradictory solution, there would be thereby increased motivation for the compositional account. Compositional account is the name of one of the what I would call pluralist accounts. So the idea here is that just accepting a contradiction is just simple. It's just the simplest solution, at least in the case of Christ, but again, it can be generalized to other paradoxes. And therefore, I mean, there is no need to go to these other proposals that are much more complicated. Some of them, for example, include meaning change. And again, he says, meaning change is also a last resort, an option taken only when there are no other viable candidates for the truth. But there is a very simple, straightforward, viable candidate, which is just to take things as they seem to be. Just rescue common sense and just say, if Christ is mutable, he's immutable. If he is mutable, he's mutable, and therefore he's mutable and immutable. And that is just simple, right? Now, just a very sharp Occam's razor, right? That is the general argument. And I wish I could talk about this because I think it's the most interesting part of the book, in my humble opinion, because it's a very deep point about simplicity in philosophy, of the role of simplicity in philosophy, it's a very important meta-philosophical, methodological point about how we should conduct our philosophical research. However, I'm not going to tackle it directly. I'm going to try to go a little bit around it in order to go back to it, because yes, this is the key element in Beall's main argument. What I'm going to do is actually going to look at one of the pluralist solutions that Beall also analyzes, and I'm going to try to defend it. I'm defend it in the at least, meaning that if we just like bracket the general argument against these proposals, and we just look at each proposal to how good they are, this is at least as good as the best other proposal, right? And therefore, whether we reject it is going to rely exclusively on the general argument. That is going to be my claim. So what is the proposal that I'm talking about? These are the qua proposals, right? Qua proposals, which is, I would say, like the quintessential pluralist strategy, right? So the idea is that we have evidence that C is P and evidence that C is not P, right? In this case, it's the mutability of Christ, but let's work in abstract terms. So we have good reasons to believe that C is P and that C is not P, but we want to avoid saying that C is both P and not P, and therefore avoid a contradiction. So what the pluralist does is to say, well, it's not that he's just P, but he's P qua blah, 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 and not P qua blah, blah, blah in two different somethings, right? In the case of Christ, it's very easily because we have available these two nice categories, which is that he is divine and human, right? So here, the proposal is to say that Christ is immutable qua divinity, but not immutable qua human, right? So that's the idea. And Beall said, well, the main problem, the main problem is that it just changes the topic, right? And here's the literal quotation. One wonders why we're now talking about these other two subjects, namely Christ qua divine and Christ qua human, when our principal focus was supposed to be Christ, right? We were talking about Christ, and we want to know whether Christ was mutable, not whether the God Christ and the human Christ, one was immutable and the other one wasn't, right? So one wonders why we're now multiplying subjects beyond Christ himself, right? Because this multiplication has two big drawbacks. One is that it's complicated, right? So just Occam's razor just there tells you, well, if you are going to multiply entities, you have to be there have to be very, very, very good reasons, right? So it's a very complicated proposal, but also it seems to change the topic, right? Because we're talking about Christ, and now we have these other two entities, and then we have to also explain how they are related to Christ. And if they're identical, then it seems that the problem returns. So, and I think Beall is right. I grant that this is a real problem with the qua solution. However, as he himself recognizes, there really is not such a thing as the qua proposal. There are different kinds of qua proposals, and he's very he's careful enough to notice that, for example, there are at least three ways that we can try to run this strategy. Right? We can run it in the subject position, in the predicate position, or in the copula. Right? So we can say that it is Christ qua divine that is immutable, and Christ qua human that is not immutable. Or we can say that Christ is qua divine, whatever that means, mutable, or is qua human, not mutable. Or we can say that Christ is mutable qua human, but immutable qua divine, right? And he gestures that more or less the difference are not that important to a certain extent. And that is where I'm going to knock and just say, maybe it's not that easy. Maybe the third proposal is definitely more attractive than the other two, right? I'm not going to say a lot about the second one, but I'm going to focus on the third one, on the qua 3 proposal, right? I think that is the one that has a lot of promise, also because it allows me to do metaphysics, and I like metaphysics. It's another one of the million things I do. Okay, so the idea is that the principle is that, as I just said, the criticism against the qua-first strategy is that it changed the topic. However, here it's not as clear that it really changed the topic. If we try to say the same thing that Beall said about qua-1 to qua-3, you can see that the criticism doesn't have the same bite, right? We would have to say something like, oh, one wonders why we're now talking about these two other properties, namely immutable qua-divine and mutable qua-human, when our principal focus was supposed to be immutability. One wonders why we're now multiplying properties beyond immutability itself. And you can say, well, yeah, we're still having a more complicated metaphysics, but it's not the same to multiply properties than to multiply Christ, right? That's a huge difference. And there's also a huge difference between changing the topic from Christ to these other Christs, that changing it from one property to other. That doesn't seem to be a big change of topic, because actually we're trying to understand Christ. Therefore, we're trying to understand what properties it has, and therefore this is the kind of metaphysical work that we should be doing. I think that it is true that an account that shifts the principal focus away from Christ would be bad, but this doesn't change the topic away from Christ, and I think that is an important virtue. Quad 3 does introduce a new ontological distinction, but it is a very metaphysically cheap, because I will argue it is grounded on distinctions in properties that are already in our metaphysics, right? So we are not having to do something specifically to talk about Christ. We are just taking tools from our metaphysical toolbox and applying here and realizing, oh, yeah, there was not a contradiction at the end. Furthermore, and this is a very important thing, it is consistent with the content of conciliary text, right? So it respects the original evidence we had in favor of both apparently contradictory claims. And as I said, it is coherent with everything else we know about properties and about change, right? So it is a metaphysical solution. I want to say that it is consistent with the content of conciliary text. I mean texts like this one, right? This is from the Tanner Decrees. We do not say that his flesh was turned into the nature of the Godhead, or that the unspeakable word of God was changed into the nature of the flesh. For he, the word, is unalterable and absolutely unchangeable and remains always the same as the sculptor said. And this is the key part, right? So he, the word, is unalterable and absolutely unchangeable and remains always the same as the scripture said. For although visible as a child and in swaddling clothes, even while he was in the bosom of the Virgin that bore him, as God, he filled the whole of creation and was fellow ruler with him who begot him, right? So what I'm going to claim here is that what the best way to interpret this sort of text is that saying that, yes, he was unchangeable as the scriptures say, right? So there is when we talk about his immutability, we're talking about his divine being. And therefore, we are talking about the domain of divine change, let's put it that way. And that these exclude, in a certain sense, other changes that are extrinsic to his divine nature, like what clothes he wore as a child, right? To be more precise, what I'm going to exploit is this distinction, this metaphysical distinction we have between properties and categories, as you know, as you should know. If not, well, I'm not going to go into an intro metaphysics here, but it's normal to think that properties are sorted through categories, right? So, and this is in order to make sense of so-called category errors, right? So a very simple example is that it makes no sense to ask whether Julius Caesar was pair of odd, because he was not the sort of entity that could be pair of odd, right? This is Frege's famous example. And the conclusion that metaphysicians have drawn from this kind of cases is that predicates are sorted into categories, right? So not all predicates can be applied to any sort of entity, but that some properties can only make sense to be predicated of entities of some category, right? For example, pair and odd are predicated of integers and denote properties of integers. And since Julius Caesar is not an integer, well, it doesn't make sense to even predicate it. So the same thing happens, I think, with human and divine as categories, right? some properties are divine, not because they are entailed by divine nature, which is something that Beall rightly criticizes, but because they are not applicable but to entities of that category, right? While there are other properties that only are applicable to human entities, like being born and doubting and things like that, while the other divine properties, presumably things like being the only begotten Son of God, being the true God, well, these are properties of Christ that he has, that are divine, right? So we can apply them to him because he is a divine entity. But it is not that he has them because he is a divine entity, which is an important metaphysical distinction. Okay. So the idea is that properties are sorted through metaphysical categories in such a way that we can tell of the properties themselves whether they are divine or human. Okay. But one important is that by saying that they are human or divine, we are not changing the nature of the property. It's the very same property that is either human or divine.
Axel, you have spoken for 20 minutes.
Cool. Yeah, and this is mostly the detail, filling in the details. So you can see the more or less obvious solution, which is that if we have this distinction, this ontological distinction between properties, then we can tell what it means to be mutable qua a category and immutable qua a different category. So to be mutable qua some category is that it can change for having one of the properties of that category to not having it. And being immutable means that if once the object in the category has that property, it cannot lose it, right? So in the case of Christ, this means that it is mutable qua human because he can change from having those human properties to not having them, but he's immutable qua divine because all the divine properties he has, he cannot lose, right? Now, so I already said it, but I'm repeating it. The qua mechanism doesn't change the meaning of the predicate. So it is not a meaning change solution because it is a metaphysical solution. It's just saying that properties themselves are categorically sorted. And what we're doing with the qua mechanism is just making explicit this distinction, this metaphysical distinction, right? Hanging on the cross qua human is just hanging on the cross, right? Being the only begotten Son of God qua divine entity is just being the only begotten Son of God. We are not changing anything there. We're not changing the meaning of the predicates. We are changing the meaning. We are noticing a change in mutability, right? We're just saying that mutability is not one property, but actually mutability is a different property depending on the category of the object belongs to. Since most objects belong to one category, we don't notice this. But when we're talking about these odd cases that when entities that belongs to more one category, then we see the difference, and that is what happens to this solution, right? So in this proposal, these qua things are work like adverbial expressions, and as such can be models and model operators. So if you like your logical solutions, it's kind of modality. And just to distinguish it from other proposals that Beall covers in his book, is not to say that he's divine and immutable, or that he's immutable because he's divine. That is not the solution. I hope it has, but we can go into more detail if you want. It is a simple solution because it satisfies the further requirement that Beall himself mentioned of having Christ as the bearer and the primary and unique bearer of these properties. So I'm not saying that there is a divine part that is the bearer of the divine properties and a human part that is the bearer of the human properties. It's just that the properties themselves are the ones that are sorted, but the entity is not divided. In the sense, it is not a compositional account as Beall characterizes them. Furthermore, it also has it's not a property of relative identity. I'm going to skip this just to save time. The idea is that they are not to Christ, right? But it is a downstream strategy, which is something that Beall criticizes, because it does weaken the entailments of immutable, but only in comparison to Beall's own proposal, right? It is not that it weakens the entailment per se, because it does make, as a pluralist solution, it just tells you that immutability is not one property, it's several properties. But all these properties have the very same semantic and therefore the very same logical behavior, right? And so as a downstream strategy, Beall can retort that insofar it involves structural changes in the semantic framework, in the systematic framework, his proposal that leaves the meaning of this predicate in place is in a prima facie better first step than to mock with said predicate. And he's right to a certain point. We are mocking with the predicates in the sense of making an ontological distinction in their extension, but not a semantic one, I will argue. And furthermore, this strategy, it is not a specific strategy against the qua or a strategy, but just a reiteration, I will argue, that of the general argument for simplicity, right? So it tells us very little specific about this qua proposal. Therefore, if I'm right, Qua 3 remains a strong contender among consistency restoring proposals. That is not only worth considering as a strong contender for explanation for the immutability of Christ, but even if Beall's first argument works, its force against Qua 3 is weaker than against other consistency restoring proposal, because it's also a very simple and conservative proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. Now, as we don't mind contradictions that much, I remember that I said that the comments by JC were going to be at the end. Well, now we changed them. And JC is going to reply right now to your comments, but you will not have time for giving back a response. So if you want to say something in the Q&A, of course, there's going to be those 30 minutes. But now, please, JC, don't take longer than 10 minutes.
Okay, because I only have 10 minutes, I want to quickly thank the organizers and begin by thanking Axel for his comments. Obviously, Axel's paper is very rich. He gets me right just about everywhere, I think. I certainly agree that my arguments against Qua 3 heavily rest on the simplicity of the contradictory account in comparison with the Qua 3 account that Axel discussed. So I take the point that I was wrong to say that it's simply a matter of the same argument against all three applies. So I concede that. But whether Axel's right about Qua 3 as a viable account is far from clear to me. Let me just say a few things. So what's nice about Axel's presentation is he, as he does in a lot of his work, invokes broader philosophical traditions and areas, and he points to the commonness of sort of pseudo-relative type of predicates. But he points to category mistakes that are best explained by the positing of categories, and you can think of predicates as relative to categories to which they apply. He gave the example of Julius Caesar and asking whether Julius Caesar is prime or odd. And that doesn't make sense. However, note that if Julius Caesar was one person with two natures, as the Chalcedon axioms at the very start of the whole project demand, if Julius Caesar were one person with two natures, namely human and natural number, then it would make sense to say that Julius Caesar is odd or prime or even. So it's not clear just how far the category issue is going to help the Qua 3 account. Let me just say one other thing. It seems to me that while Axel has made, I take his negative point. I was wrong to say that my criticism applies equally to Qua 3 in just the same form. But on whether the Qua 3 approach is viable, I think that not enough has been said. And if you think about it, this sort of Christ is mutable hyphen qua hyphen human. Of course, the hyphens are rarely put in there, but it's misleading to leave them out because this is a new predicate. This is a predicate that sounds like it's making a lot of sense, but we know nothing about it. It might as well be spelled, is blankety blank 1, and then the other is blankety blank 2. What we need are the satisfaction conditions for these predicates. We need to know the properties actually expressed by them. For example, does immutable qua divine, does it entail that the bearer of that, the subject who satisfies that predicate, does it entail that that subject is immutable, period, or divine, period? Axel says no, not on his way of thinking about it. But if it doesn't entail that, I don't know what we're talking about. So the viability of that approach turns entirely on more details. Absolutely no details have been given. This isn't a slam on Axel, but I mean the actual tradition. So I'll just leave my comments there.
Thank you, JC. I think we are going to move to Luis. Luis, are you ready?
I am.
And then before we start with you, then I have to say that again, as we don't mind contradictions, Axel is going to be the next chair when Luis finishes. So. Thank you, Luis. Luis Estrada is one of our most brilliant researchers from the Institute of Philosophical Research. He works on philosophical logic, especially in non-classical logic. And, well, he is one of the organizers of this event, so we have to thank him for having JC and having everybody here today. So thank you, Luis. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, JC, and Axel, Maria, and everyone else for joining us in this session. I will start with two disclaimers. The first one, I will discuss JC's book, but I will not discuss Christology at all. So I'm sorry. I was just into the logical part, chapter 2. So my comments will be devoted to that. And second disclaimer, I must say that I am very sympathetic to JC's ideas on logic, very, very sympathetic. Nonetheless, I have different thoughts on certain crucial issues. So those differences entail for me that if there is anything as the one true logic, it should be much weaker than FDE. I would say that it is the empty logic. Nonetheless, I will not discuss my views on logic. I am not going to do that. It's very crazy. So I will act rather as a person who says that the one true logic is not as weak as FDE. right? So it's a fairly more likely interlocutor for JC's ideas. So here is a slide with a lot of text because it's filled in with JC's ideas on logic. He says that logic is a very special consequence relation, is the common core of all theories, that logic is universal and foundational, and that it is so because it focuses only on so-called logical vocabulary. And then he says that logical entailment is a relation of necessary truth preservation over relevant possibilities, and usual stuff. He says, well, an entailment is logically invalid if and only if there is a counterexample, where a counterexample is a possibility in which the premises in the argument are true, but the conclusion is not true. And the logic is involved in all consequence relations for our truth theories, and that logic achieves this universal role because it deals with the widest space of possibilities. It's very quickly general ideas on logic, JC's ideas on logic. And moreover, he says that for him, FDE is the correct account of logic in the sense that we have just seen. It's the universal closure of all our truth theories and blah, blah, blah. And then he says that this account of logic has three main virtues. And the first one is that the familiar truth and falsity conditions are maintained. And by that, he means that the truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary are precisely the same conditions used in the standard classical logic account. That will be very important for my comments. And the second virtue is that the resulting logic is topic neutral, which is a desirable property of logic. And also that this account of logic doesn't force unique, strange phenomena into the cramped realm of the classical possibilities. Right? That's the very quick presentation of JC's ideas on logic in this book. So my comments will be based on certain properties of FDE. So I will give some details of this logic. So we can take FDE as a logic that evaluates arguments built upon disconnectives and negation, conjunction, disjunction. And I put the conditional there. I will say something about the conditional. And following these assignments, and as JC says, these assignments are easily recognized by the classical logician as their assignments, right? Negation of A is true if and only if A is false, and the negation is false if and only if A is true, and the usual story for conjunction, disjunction, and the conditional as well. And so, something important here is that the is here is not the is of identity. So the evaluation is two-valued. We have only two truth values, truth and false, but the assignments are not truth functional. They are just relations between the language and the truth values. So we have four options. Yes, a sentence can be just true, or just false, or neither true nor false, or both true and false, right? So yes, the is here is not the is of identity. But nonetheless, we can have a truth table presentation of FDE, like we have it here. I will skip reading these tables. It's just notation and terminology, what I will use for just true, just false, and both true and false, and neither of them, right? I hope most of you are familiar with this. Now, the conditional here in FDE is extensional in the sense that we can define it as not A or B, right? This means that the conditional here is true if and only if the antecedent is false or the consequent is true. I will skip the falsity condition. I don't need that for now. Now, one important thing about this extensional conditional here in FDE is that it doesn't satisfy identity nor detachment, right? And JC seems to be okay with that. He says, well, FDE is logic. Logic doesn't allow a conditional with these properties, so we don't have a conditional in logic with these properties. That's fine. But most people are not okay with this. Most people would say, wait. This is logic. There must be a good conditional in logic, right? So probably then FD is not the best account of logic that we can have. It's part of the best account of logic, but it's not the full story. And okay, let's take the following axiomatic presentation of FDE. This is opinionated because it's a formula presentation of FDE, but it doesn't matter. What those people who think that we need a good conditional in logic would say something like this: FD is part of the correct account of logic. It's not the full story because it still needs a good conditional. So we need some FD principles strengthened into arrow form. And so we could have something like this. FDE suitably enriched with a conditional which delivers this identity simplification, addition, and so on in arrow form. This is, for example, advocated in some works by Rautli Silvan, and actually he calls this logic FDE. For him, this right part is FDE properly. So okay, that would be the proposal. We have FDE with this new conditional. Silvan calls it the Chilonian Conditional. Now, what does it take to have FDE with this new conditional? Well, we need a conditional with this truth table, and the evaluation conditions are horrible, but you have them there. In Christian, the truth condition is, for example, that a conditional is true if and only if either the antecedent is false or the consequent is true, or the antecedent is neither true nor false, but the consequent is neither true nor false as well. If we add this conditional to FDE, we are going to have this very nice logic, which Silvan likes. Okay, what could JC or some FDE supporter could say about this logic enriched with the Chilonian conditional? Well, the first reaction could be, look, this logic is not the universal closure of our true theories. Well, maybe, show me. In fact, I haven't found any arguments by JCs in the book to the effect that no logic stronger than FDE belongs to the universal closure. He has argued convincingly that FDE should be there, but the identity that FDE is the universal closure is not clear to me. I'm waiting for argument for this first objection. The second objection could be as follows. Look, this FDE plus the Chilonian Conditional doesn't deal with the widest space of possibilities. I would say, no, this is wrong, because as in FDE, the sentences can be just true, just false, but true and false, and etc. All classical control models are FDE plus conditional, Chilonian conditional control models, etc. I would say that the space of possibilities has not been restricted. We have just added a new conditional with different evaluation conditions. It's not the extensional one, but the space of possibilities has not been restricted. Another reply could be, look, okay, the Chilonian arrow is very different from the other connectives in JC's account. It's not like the annulation, it's not like negation, it's not then like conjunction or disjunction. This Chilonian conditional has very weird evaluation conditions. Okay, I think that sort of reply doesn't carry much weight, because that's not very different from other approaches to logic. Think, for example, in logics where all but the conditional are extensional connectives, for example. You have extensional connectives, negation, conjunction, and disjunction, and then you give an intentional treatment to the conditional, and nobody complains about that, right? So that the Chilonian arrow is different from the other connectives in that sense, it's not so strong, not so strong reply to me. But let me say something more about that sort of reply. Okay, it happens in other accounts of logic. We leave the extensional connectives alone, but the conditional is intentional. So we give very complicated evaluation conditionals for conditions for the conditional. But nonetheless, JC or any other FDE supporter could say that the FDE evaluation conditions are better than those in the enriched logic. I'm not sure about that. The original claim was that that FDE enjoys exactly the same truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary as the classical accounts, and that the meanings of logical vocabulary are what they have always been. That was the original claim. Now the claim would be that FDE has better evaluation conditions than other logics, but I'm not sure about this. What counts as a better evaluation condition than other? I don't know. JC is not explicit about this, and neither in the book nor in other works defending FDE. But I was trying to imagine some argument, and he could say, look, the evaluation conditions in FDE don't have odd mixtures. All of them are formulated in positive terms. Let me go back to this. What do I mean by that? These conditions, for example, is the conjunction is true if and only if A is true and B is true. The disjunction is false if and only if A is false and B is false. It's always the is positive there. And we don't have that for the Chilonian conditional. You have both positive clauses like the antecedent is false, but also negative clauses like okay, the antecedent is neither true nor false, but then the consequent is blah blah blah, right? Is not so uniform. This sort of evaluation conditions are not uniform. It mixes positive clauses with negative clauses, and in that sense, it's not that good as the FD original evaluation conditions. Okay, fair enough. But again, the claim was that FDE was a good account because, among other things, the truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary was the same as the truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary were the same as in classical logic, but after having something like the Chilonian conditional, it is not clear what are the same truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary as the classical account, because the classical logician can recognize the Chilonian evaluation conditions as his own conditional, it formulated in some complicated ways, but still the same as in classical logic. Compare, for example, this truth condition. A conditional is true if and only if the antecedent is false or the consequent is true, which is the truth condition in FD, and the following truth condition: a conditional is true if and only if the antecedent is not true and the consequent is not false. For the classical logician, this is the same, right? But for someone working with more possibilities like JC's accounts, they give rise to different conditionals. So there should be more argument to say, oh, look, this logic with this particular conditional is the correct account of logic.
Luis,
I don't know.
You have spoken for 20 minutes.
Okay, I will finish in 5, I would say. Consider this very strange logic and compare it to FD. You have FD evaluation conditions on the left side, and on the right side, you have the evaluation conditions for this weird logic that I call the negative clauses logic. And consider negation. The evaluation conditions for negation in FD say that negation is true if and only if the non-negated formula is false. But on the right side, we have that the negation is true if and only if the formula is not true, and so on and so forth for the remaining connectives. The evaluation conditions are formulated not in positive terms like here. This formula has this value, but rather the evaluation condition is that the formula has certain value if and only if something doesn't happen, right? And this is uniformly so for all the connectives. Then you get very strange logic. Of course, one could say, look, it is very well known that this negation is Boolean negation. So probably you are going to end up with classical logic, but that's not the case. This negative clauses logic is not classical logic because identity is not valid there. You have a control model there. However, it validates that a contradiction implies any B, which is not very useful for Beall's project on Christology. But nonetheless, I think the moral is this: not all the combinations of classical approval, because there are many of these things, not just the evaluation conditions picked up by JC. There are many ways of presenting the same evaluation conditions for the classical logician. And not all the combination of those with the widest space of possibilities give good results, at least not for the classical logician. So one has to look at the intended valid arguments too. So I would say that the way to FDE is not so straightforward as JC thinks. He has to say a lot more about his account of logic should be richer in order to get rid of certain competitors like this FDE plus the Chilonian Conditional. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, JC, please. Remember, no longer than 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, let me thank Luis very much for the comments, for the engagement, and for the overall workshop. Thank you. Yeah, obviously there's some very deep and very interesting issues in the philosophy of logic that Luis has raised. In the service of time and in the hope that other participants will have plenty of time to ask questions, let me boil things down to 3 issues and touch on each very, very quickly. The first issue is just generally classical versus subclassical debate, and whether the truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary are the same as I claim. The second issue that Luis set aside is, even once you go subclassical, how deep do you go? Lewis's own personal view is you should go all the way down to the nil logic. He took that off the table. I will follow suit and take that off the table, not because it's not interesting or important. That's a hard issue, but it's not the main issue here. So that leaves us with the first one. And the last one is the issue of a conditional, logic's conditional. Okay. On the first issue, the debate between classical and subclassical, and let's just zero in because we're setting the second issue aside. We're zeroing in on FDE. Well, both traditions have largely settled upon, standard first order vocabulary, setting identity aside, because that has been one of the most controversial issues, namely whether identity is a logical bit of vocabulary or some extra logical. So I start with the tradition that settles on standard first order vocabulary minus identity. Now the question is, are we even talking about the same things? Are the meanings the same? Well, if we take the meanings to be reflected in truth and falsity conditions, there are, as Lewis reviewed, uncontroversial conditions, the ones that he reviewed right at the start. For example, a negation is true and a possibility or whatever, if and only if the negatum is false there. It's false if and only if the negatum is true there, and so on. Lewis pushes as to why those conditions should be the ones that we treat as giving the meaning, rather than, as he noted, a slew of other ways of presenting the semantics for classical or LP or K3 or anything above FD. You can give different conditions and still get the same behavior. Well, I think if there's to be a fruitful debate, we have to start by agreeing on the language and the meaning. And so that's why I start there. I think that we both agree on that. And the question is, why do we think that falsity and untruth collapse into the same thing? Well, it's not forced on us from those given meanings. We need some other reason to do that. And I know that Lewis's personal views, he agrees, but as trying to be a very useful interlocutor, I guess I think that sort of the collapse of untruth and falsity has to be a result of the theory. It doesn't come out of the uncontroversial meanings of the connectives. Okay, so that's one general thought. Let me jump to the other thing, and then I'll leave the rest for Q&A with participants or Lewis or however it works. The conditional, right? Well, my own view is that the logical vocabulary, as I reviewed, qua universal topic neutral vocabulary in all true and complete as possible theories, just contains the material conditional, which is, as Lewis reviewed. As Lewis told us, that leaves logic with a very, very weak conditional indeed. But the weakness is the result of logic's universal reach. Where the strength of logic's conditional emerges is in the confines of a true theory, through what I've elsewhere called shrieking and shrugging. Indeed, it's in a theory's constraints on the theory's predicates, where the theory gives logic's conditional its typical stronger behavior. And I point to, for example, you think of the true theory of arithmetic. Take it to be piano arithmetic. I'm not arguing for that. This is just an example. That's just the material conditional. Now, if the material conditional in that theory were only allowed to go as far as logic itself says, then piano arithmetic would be a lot weaker than it already is. But it's not. So you might think, well, it's a different conditional. It's not actually logic's conditional, and therefore that's not the universal blah, blah, blah. Well, no. What's happening is, in that theory, you're putting constraints on the predicates of the theory. And those constraints wind up giving logic's material conditional the entailment behavior that you're used to. Finally, I think that intentional conditionals are very, very common, but they're simply extra logical. They figure in some, but obviously not all true theories. So I think that the criticisms of FD's conditional are misplaced. What's being demanded of logic's conditional is achieved through the constraints on a theory's predicates, or it is achieved via extra logical vocabulary, like, for example, the Chilonian conditional that's added to the language of certain theories. So that would be my general response to Lewis. I leave a lot to be debated there, I understand, but I'm trying to be short and at least give you the direction of reply. So thanks, Lewis.
Muchísimas gracias, JC. Thank you so much, JC. I hope we'll have more of this in the discussion. Now it is time for our third speaker, la doctora María Martínez Ordaz. Ella es postdoctorante actualmente de la Universidad Federal de Río de Janeiro. Hizo su doctorado aquí con nosotros en el posgrado de Filosofía de la Ciencia y es una experta en paraconsistencia, especialmente en ciencia. Es verdad, su proyecto actual es acerca de cómo entender información defectuosa en ciencia y filosofía. Ese también vas a tener 30 minutos y a los 20 minutos te voy a avisar. Muchísimas gracias, María, por favor.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Thank you, Axel. Thank you, of course, Luis, for inviting me to join the project, and thank you, JC, for being here, but also for writing the book. So, as Axel said, I am a philosopher of science. So, the view that I'm going to present here relies a lot on what I have learned from philosophy of inconsistent science. So, the first thing that I want to do is to reconstruct a bit the view, JC's view, and the part that I'm going to focus on, which is the central argument for defending that Christ is a non-problematically contradictory being. Some of this has already been mentioned by Axel, so I'll try to go very fast. And the first idea is that Christ is contradictory because if we look at the descriptions that we often get about Christ, we will find that he has all the limitness of God, but also all the limits of humans. And many of these pairs of things that look like contradictory are going to be part of the descriptions of Christ. And the second idea is that the contradictory character of Christ is non-problematic. And this is very important. So, because it doesn't seem to threaten any sensible reason in any significant way, which, according to classical logic, might be if it is actually contradictory. So what JC will say is once we recognize that it is contradictory, then we have to see if it has any problems associated to its nature. And what he says is that at least at an inferential level, we don't get any hints of having any trouble when working with the idea of contradictory Christ. On the one hand, humans do not have any problems like inferring which are the things that are going to be true about Christ. And on the other hand, the theories that can assume that Christ is contradictory will not be trivial. And we have plenty of ideas about why they are not trivial. We don't get things that intuitively are false about Christ as entailments of the theories that assume that Christ is contradictory. So we now have the intuition that its contradictory character is not going to be problematic, not for humans, not for the theories that contain it as it is. Later on, he will argue that Christ is an essentially contradictory entity due to actually possessing two contradictory natures. This will have an effect on having an entity at the core of a theory that is going to be necessarily inconsistent or necessarily contradictory. And this also will have the effect that if we want to accurately depict the characteristics of Christ and depict the nature of Christ, we will have to assume that these contradictions are going to be true of the phenomena that we are describing, which is going to be Christ. And so that said, it will argue that Christ is a non-problematically contradictory being. What I'm going to do here is first to explain why this argument and explicitly the outcome of the argument is like a large contribution for the literature. And then I'm going to focus on three different questions to challenge the scope of the outcome and also the grounds of the project. And I'm gonna go through them very superficially, but if you have any questions, I believe, like in more detail, I believe JC is ready to answer them in more detail as well. So first of all, the contribution. So the idea is that Christ is not only an entity that can be described as in an inconsistent manner, but it's an entity that demands to be understood qua contradictory. In this sense, in any theory in which Christ exists as and is contradictory, there will be according to some interpretations, many contradictions about him that are going to be necessarily true. The novelty of this proposal is that even if there have been early attempts to identify a non-formal domain that legitimately demands to be described and explained through true contradictions, these attempts can be systematically failed. And the basic idea behind this is that paraconsistent logicians have tried to motivate the value of paraconsistent logic not only in formal areas, but also saying that there are independent mind phenomena that need to be described via paraconsistent resources. And so people have tried to identify things that actually do so, that demand to be described through contradictions. But in many cases, what they have found is that these contradictions are either apparent or temporarily tolerated, but the entities or the phenomena that is apparently inconsistent is not inconsistent at its core. And so there's an intuition that paraconsistent logics might help us as reasoners to deal with inconsistent information, but not as scientists, for instance, to describe accurately any particular phenomenon. And so if JC's reconstruction of the contradictory Christ is correct, this will have a huge impact on this literature, because he would have found an inconsistency that is needed for describing a phenomena, and that is part of the core of a particular theory that has shaped the cosmovisions of 2000 years. So this is going to be huge in the case JC is correct. So two of the most important outcomes of the contradictory Christ will include identifying a Christ as a non-problematically contradictory being, as well as laying the foundations for an investigation of the logical consequences of the existence of Christ, qua contradictory, within a particular theory, which is going to be the contradictory Christology that JC puts forward. So the aim of this participation, for instance, is to challenge the grounds of JC's research, as well as the scope of the outcomes. I will try to put forward three questions. And these three questions are going to be mostly motivated by the epistemological grounds that his project has. So the first one is, what is it required for the identification of a contradiction? The second one is, how can we recognize a true contradiction from either an apparent or a temporal contradiction? And the third one is, if we identify a true contradiction within a theory, where can we actually go from there? So the first idea is, let's focus on the methodological roots of the project. JC is defending an approach that aims at the rational investigation of the claims made in religious texts and practices, aimed at investigating and clarifying the nature of the objects, in this case Christ, and narratives of religious worship. For people like JC, religion will be a domain of inquiry susceptible to rational investigation, just the sort of approach rejected by thinkers like Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, which are going to pay more attention to the dogma and the practices in themselves. And so Beall's approach to Christ takes Christ to be a theoretical entity that is either postulated, described, explained, etc., by the theory of Christology in this case, and takes the theory of Christology to be a theory that provides us with general picture of the world in which Christ exists, would exist, regardless of whether this picture coincides with our actual world. In this sense, we can take Christology as to be very similar to a scientific theory. And he also has this mentions through the book in which he makes this connection. So he takes Christian theology to be a theory of God, as a macrophysics is a theory of the macrophysical world, and just a mathematical theories are theories of the respective mathematical phenomena. So in this sense, his approach is going to be very similar to approaches to inconsistent science that have already been put forward many decades ago. And my general worry is that while doing something like that, while theories may refer to mind-independent phenomena, the interpretations, the reconstructions, and the uses of the theories are at least partially constrained or driven by agents' preferences and cognitive limitations. And so the first question will be, what is required for the identification of a contradiction? The basic idea is that if one looks at Jace's book, since the very beginning, he will characterize a contradiction very simply. And he will say a formal contradiction is any sentence of the form, it is true that X and it is false that X. A contradictory being, as he describes, as discussed above, is a being of whom some contradictions per above is true. And this is not enough. According to me, this is not enough to see clear if there is a contradiction or not. Because some of the examples that Beall uses to support his claim are not explicit of this form, but have to be additionally interpreted as such. For instance, Christ possesses all of the limitedness of God, and Christ possesses all of the limits of humans. This requires an additional interpretation that makes explicit that possessing the limitedness of God implies the falsity of possessing the limits of humans, and vice versa. And so there are going to be two approaches to solve this problem. On the one hand, one can find the material content one, mostly characterized by the material inference approach. And on the other hand, we will find more logical form-driven approaches. And so the first one, the material inference approach, will say that we don't pay much attention to the logical form of what we think is a contradiction, but we pay attention to the content and to the way to interpret the content in such a way that we see that two things are not compatible, or if one is true, the other must be false. But the objection to this approach, for the Christ case, is that Christ is a very peculiar entity. It could be perfectly okay to assume that for this entity, because it's very special, such properties do not conflict in any relevant sense. Similarly, that we have, at least in the particular theories that we are having in mind, similarly to the way in which wave and particle do not conflict with each other when explaining the nature of light in quantum mechanics. So then it doesn't seem enough to say that, okay, let's take a material content approach and we will see very straightforwardly how this is an actual contradiction. So let's move to the logical form, maybe that helps. So for the logical form, we have many objections in the cases of inconsistent science because they involve content as well as a structure. So when we say that a contradiction is going to be, it is true that X and it is false that X, we have two challenges to deal with. The first one is to explain that X actually means the same in both parts of the conjunction. And the second challenge is to say that the conjunction is justified. These two things are being used in the same domain. And the main objection inspired in these two challenges is to say that we have some cases, for instance, the infinitesimal calculus, Newtonian infinitesimal calculus case, in which we have entities that seem to be inconsistent. But when we pay more attention to which is the nature of these entities, we will realize that they are not actually contradictory, but that they are described in an inconsistent manner as shortcuts for us reasoners to be able to move information faster or more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So the question is, are these uses indicating, when we use Christ as an inconsistent entity, are these uses indicating something like epistemic shortcuts to deal with Christ in an efficient manner, such as it happens in the early calculus example? Or how can we know that we are correct when identifying these things as contradictions and not as something that we as epistemic agents are just using, even if we know that Christ is not contradictory? Sorry. So the general first question is, how do we know that in the case of Christ, the contradiction is not a result of at least is not driven by our linguistic or our cognitive limitations to consistently express and describe the nature of Christ? So the second question is, let's take that JC has already responded to this objection satisfactorily, and that he has shown us a way to identify correctly these things as contradictions. So how can we distinguish these things as true contradictions and not as others, such as temporary contradictions or apparent contradictions? For this, I will not go through this general argument in detail, but the basic idea is that we have to consider ignorance and the role that ignorance plays in our understanding of inconsistent science when we have cases that seem to illustrate inconsistency toleration in the sciences. The idea is that most of the time, we don't know which of the two things that seem contradictory is actually false or is actually true. And most of the time, at least one is not literally true. And so meanwhile, we discover which one is the most reliable one, which one is an approximation, the result of an idealization, something that is false but we use anyway, and so on. We tolerate the contradiction. And so when we see somebody working with inconsistent information, if we keep in mind this general idea about ignorance, then we have to consider the option that this person is actually ignorant of which of the elements of the contradiction is false or which is actually true. And in these cases, we will have to consider the option as well, that this contradiction is not a true contradiction, but something that is being tolerated temporarily, or that it only has the appearance of being a contradiction, but in more detail, we will see that it is not actually conflicting information in action. And so going back to the Christ example, if we take this generic explanation of why we tolerate contradictions in the sciences, then we will be able to interpret very easily what JC focuses on and calls the epistemic mystery strategy. In a nutshell, according to the epistemic mystery strategy, Christ appears to be contradictory. The appearance is unavoidable in any available candidate for the true and sufficiently complete theory of Christ. But the theory is perfectly acceptable by standard norms because the apparent contradiction, through the inevitable, is only apparently contradictory. The apparent contradiction is due to an equivocation of the wrapping in which is beyond our ken. So basically, this mystery strategy is taking into account that because we are finite agents, because we fail at seeing certain things as humans, then we are going to be ignorant of the actual consistent nature of Christ, and we will call it inconsistent or contradictory, but it's going to be an error. So if that works for us, for reasoning more efficiently about Christ, that's okay. But we don't have to move that to say that Christ is actually expressed in terms of inconsistent propositions, or that any accurate description of him that corresponds to his nature will be contradictory. So JC will support this view by appealing to two basic epistemic virtues, which are going to be simplicity and neutrality. There are the first one, simplicity. He says that there is an altruism that if something looks like a dog, sounds like a dog, behaves like a dog, and then, well, it's most probably a dog. One value of the saying is that a methodological reminder, the best explanation of an appearance, is often that the appearance is veridical. For the case of neutrality, what JC will say is that because it seems, the simplicity, it seems that his interpretation of Christ is the most veridical one, or the most intuitive one, then contradictory Christology is neutral with respect to the true epistemology, or at least as far closer to neutrality than any epistemic mystery strategy can sustain. I'm not going to focus on neutrality, but I will say something very briefly about simplicity. The first objection that we have is that we often fail when judging the obvious. And we have many examples of this in traditional epistemology. Something looks like something, walks like something, smells like something, or whatever, and it's not that thing. Once we get close to it, once we go analytic through it. And there we have that. But also, these epistemic goods that JC is putting forward, such as being more explanatory of the phenomenon, being more accurate of the phenomenon, and so on, are epistemic goods that in a sense require truth. We cannot, traditionally, knowledge would require truth. Explanation, like the strong idea of explanation, will require truth. And also understanding will require truth. So if JC is saying that through contradictory Christology, we are going to achieve all these goods, especially through accepting the contradictory nature of Christ, then he, in a sense, will have to commit to the truth of the contradictions involved. But this is intuitively a problem, because if we look at all the history of science looking for true contradictions in empirical domains or in domains that are not exclusively formal, that are not basically motivated by paradoxes, then we'll have a problem. And we'll see that all these attempts to identify the aletheias outside of this formal realm have failed. And so we don't have enough evidence to think that the most likely interpretation of this, the most veridical one, it's going to be that the contradiction is true. So in that sense,
María,
thank you, Axel. In that sense, JC has still to put forward an explanation of how we can deal with this overwhelming evidence against identifying things such as the aletheias outside of realms that are not constrained by formal, very, very formal information. And so that said, let's accept that JC brings a response to this standpoint, and we still have another question, which is going to shape, the response is going to shape the second outcome of the book, which is laying the standards for getting an approach, a formal approach to whatever this means, finding the idea that Christ is contradictory. And so the question is, if we identify a true contradiction within a theory, where can we actually go from there? The intuition behind JC's work is that we have to say something about the logical consequence relation and its not explosive character. That the logical consequence relation of the theory, in this case, the contradictory Christology. And one quote that can summarize this spirit is the following: but hold on, if the theory appears, for all we can see, contradictory, and is also classed under classical logic, the theory is trivial, and it contains all sentences of the language of the theory, including not only each and every heretical sentence. And the basic idea of this quote is that if we have granted that we identified a contradiction in Christology, and that is a contradiction, at least one that is true about the nature of Christ, then if all this is correct, this is a refutation of the idea that the theory is closed under classical logic. Nonetheless, there is a major objection against this methodology. And it's coming from Michael, for example, in 2016. And the complaint is, the idea here would be that there are interesting and productive inconsistent theories from which people do not infer random and unconnected conclusion. So it might be thought that the logic they use does not license such inferences, in particular principle of explosion. Nonetheless, from a particular case that illustrates temporal inconsistency toleration, or something that looks like inconsistency toleration, abductively, one infers that the best explanation of this toleration is that either the reasoning of the agents using the theory in questions were closed under any preconsistent logical consequence relation, leaving as the only future task for the logicians to determine which is the specific paraconsistent logic that allows to better explain the particular case. And this we can call it the abductive argument in favor of paraconsistency. However, as many of you might have the intuition of, this has some major problems. And basically, the things that we can say is that it assumes two things that we have not enough evidence in favor of. The first one is the presupposition of logical explosion, meaning that the theory must be closed under a particular logical consequence relation. And once we don't have triviality, then we can move forward to say, oh, there was no logical explosion of the type that I was expecting, at least. The second assumption is the presupposition of logical closure for the case of epistemic agents. Oh, the agents are not reasoning arbitrarily once they accepted the contradictions about Christ, so it must be said that there is some paraconsistency around. But we have, on the contrary, we have enough evidence to say that it's not clear that we have any type of logical closure as epistemic agents, as rational agents. And we also have some ideas against the first part, that we don't have any clarity about how logical explosion might look like in the cases of inconsistent theories that have material content, that are driven by the content in itself. Not only empirical theories, but other types of theories, such as going to be Christology. So what JC can say is, okay, we can grant the idea that cognitive scientists have put forward enough evidence to challenge the idea that human agents can have any type of logical closure, or that rational beliefs or justified beliefs are closed under a particular type of logical closure. But we can say something about the theories. And anyway, if we look at the type of theory that it seems that JC is aiming to describe, we will have another problem. So if the theory of contradictory Christology is so complex, as he often says in the book, that we cannot scrutinize it to this core because we are limited, cognitively limited, and so on, the only hints that we might have about its inferential constraints will be the ways in which agents reason with the theory's information. This is the ways in which they use fragments of the theory. But even if we identify a true contradiction within a theory, where can we go from there? How can we escape the constrained realm of the agent's reason to say something more general about the inferential grounds of the contradictory Christology as a theory and other inconsistent theories? That said, I'm just going to sum up and say that there are three major points in the contribution that I focus on from the book, which are going to be that Christ is a contradictory being. But this might be challenged by the question of what is it required for the accurate or the correct identification of a contradiction? How can we deal with these problems of interpreting something mistakenly as a contradiction? And the second point of this argument is going to appeal to the non-problematic character of Christ being contradictory. Nonetheless, we still need an explanation about how this project is still making any sense, because of the last thing that I said. We as cognitive agents are going to be so limited to be able to say something about logical consequence relations, either of the theory or out of our reasoning. So we still need more explanations, more methodological resources to be able to address how can we infer something about the closure of the theory or of a reasoning. The third point of the argument is that Christ is an essentially contradictory entity. And if we assume this, he's going to be at the core of the ontology of the theory, making all the properties of Christ being necessarily true for the emergence of more truths through the theory. Still, we have to answer a question of how can we recognize a true contradiction from either an apparent or a temporal contradiction. And that said, thank you, everybody. Thank you, JC, for the book, and look forward to listening to your responses.
Muchísimas gracias, María. Thank you, María. That was great. JC, would you like to say something, please?
Yes, Maria, thank you. Incredibly rich engagement with the book, and your work on paraconsistency in science is a really important lens through which to see some of this. So thank you. Just because of time, let me just jump to one thing, and then if discussion picks it up, we can go further. I'll just try to address two of the three questions at least, but very quickly, again, just given time. So first off, I agree with the Gil Harman, and I don't know the Michael work. I'll look at that. But I certainly agree with Gil Harman that logic is one thing and human reasoning and acceptance rejection behavior is another. And, you know, so logic is something that underwrites a theory. The extent to which our reasoning and acceptance rejection behavior should somehow mirror logic is just never been clear to me. Look, getting to the true theory of anything, whether it's really radical and peculiar or whether it's common or, you know, whatever, that's a difficult thing. And I think that we simply have no clue how to do it. We just do it and we keep trying to improve on it. So in an effort to come to the true theory of something, I think that we do have a couple general methodological rules of thumb. I talk about these a bit in chapter 6. I wish I had talked about them a lot earlier and in more detail, but especially in light of your comments. But the three rules of thumb are: one, seek a consistent theory. That is, for any sentence P in the language of the theory, try to put only P or not P into the theory. Seek a complete theory. That is, for any sentence P in the language of the theory, try to put either P or not P into the theory. Logic doesn't tell you what to do there. It's just, you know, these are methodological rules of thumb. And then the third is try to have a simple theory, not with all these gadgets and Baroque constructions that have to try to prop up the theory to make sure that you're satisfying one or the other of the, or both of the first two rules. In reality, of course, it's hard to satisfy all three rules. And sometimes we give up completeness to save consistency and simplicity. Sometimes we'll give up inconsistency to save simplicity and completeness. And quite often, at least in philosophy, if you know, people give up simplicity to maintain consistency and completeness. My view is it's a case-by-case thing. I don't have a general rule. I will be shocked if there's a general rule. I will be thrilled if there's a general rule, but I doubt it. So that's just a general perspective on me agreeing with Harman. And again, I haven't read it, but I take it Michael. Now, your final question of where to go once we've identified a true contradiction in the theory. I'm not sure exactly. So I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're after there by way of answer. Where we go is, I mean, if it's a question about what should we think follows from that, that's a hard question, as hard as the first one. But if it's a question of, okay, you have a contradiction in the theory, you accept that your theory is true, the contradiction appears to have this as a natural consequence. Maybe the question is, should the theory have an entailment relation that does in fact give that consequence or not? That's an interesting and hard problem, and I don't know the answer to that. But so I guess just with an eye on the clock, I fear out of my three responses, my response to you, Maria, is the most unsatisfying because you've raised such deep questions. So, but I hope that's helpful somewhat.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you again, Professor Beall, Professor Martínez. We're going to open the discussion. We still have about 30 minutes for more discussion for Q&A. While you raise your hands, I hope you can use the reaction section here at Zoom. While you raise your hands, I'm going to start with a question that was set on YouTube. As you know, we are also broadcasting live on YouTube. So there, Leonardo Amado made the following question. There are biblical articles that imply that Jesus Christ and God reject contradictions, especially those in which God or Jesus Christ themselves are defined as self-contradictory. So what about that? Can you say something about it, Professor Beall?
I would need to know the details of what the questioner has in mind. I've heard, so there's a theologian, Thomas McCall, who has pointed to some passages where it looks like where you might take it that Christ is pointing to an apparent contradiction and saying, you know, you shouldn't do that. I'm just not thinking. I wish I had it on the tip of my tongue, but those, I think that's in his new book, which is in the Oxford Analytic Theology series. It's on Christology. So I would recommend to the questioner to look at that. I guess it's one thing that another theologian, James Anderson, wrote is he said that if you think that Christ is a contradictory being, then God, the description of God, he said something like this. This is not an exact quote. The true description of God involves falsehoods, but of course, in the New Testament, followers of Christ are told not to mislead or lie and so on. So maybe the questioner has that in mind. I don't think that there's any lying or misleading going on. There's a big difference between that and a falsehood that's also true. So you should always avoid speaking falsely unless the only way to do it, unless it's at the cost of telling the truth. So, yeah, so that's the best I can do, trying to come up with what might have been the issue. That's all I have on that.
Thank you. I'm going to read another question from the chat group. It's there are a couple there. First from Fanny del Rio. She congratulates us all, but she especially enjoyed María Martínez Ordaz analysis, because I do think that the heart of the matter of J.C. Beall's theory is what we can understand by contradictory. I am thinking that many explanations in the Bible appears contradictory, but it can be argued that they only appears contradictory. Theologians have argued, for example, that creationism and evolution are not really contradictory, but complementary. But to sum it up in a question, perhaps it can be this: is Christ contradictory, or is the contradiction only in us?
I think that Christ himself is contradictory. by which I mean that there are contradictions true of Christ. As you rightly say, the vast majority of Christian theologians and philosophers and thinkers generally have done everything they can to see Christ or the Trinitarian God, which is another, that's I'm working on that book now as a follow-up, but you know, they've done everything they can to explain away the apparent contradiction, to try to say the contradiction, as you say, is only in our language. It's the best we can do with such a transcendent being and so on. That's a common response to the apparent contradiction. My own view is, and look at the heresies, right? The heresies that of saying that Christ is actually two persons. You don't get a contradiction if there are two persons. One is divine and the other is human, and somehow we just call them one or something. Or Christ is not really divine, he's just human, or he's not really human, he's just divine, looks human. And all these things are heresies, and all that means is they've been ruled out as missing the target core theory, or the reality. They miss the reality. Now, why have people for so long tried to get around the contradiction, whether they're doing it by way of heresy or whether they're doing it in some non-heretical way? I really think it comes down to they just never pause to ask, could this actually be a contradictory being? And the reason they do that is they think that logic itself demands that there be no contradictions. Reality itself cannot be contradictory. But if you pause and ask yourself why, you'll see that there's not a lot going for that view. I'm not saying it's incorrect, but I think that there are good reasons for thinking that the right account of logic is weaker than one that would back the drive to escape the contradiction. So I hope that helps. That's an important question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to read a comment and another question, and then we have another question from Jesus. So let me just give me a few seconds to read. It's just from Itala María Lofredo Dotaviano. She just wanted to ask us all and thank the intriguing discussions. As she is a paraconsistent logician, she says, I am very, very, very much like Beall's approaches. Unfortunately, I have to leave the meeting. So just wanted to give her best regards. Then we have a question from Susana Gomez and for JC. In your book, you say that one of the reasons to accept contradictory Christology over other theories is that it's metaphysically neutral. But what seems to be behind the idea of the existence of a contradictory being is a sort of a metaphysical diletheism, which claims that there are contradictions in the world. Couldn't we say then that after all, besides a commitment with a non-standard notion of logical consequence, the contradictory Christology also assumes certain metaphysical commitments, although evidently not commitments about substance, property, etc. If this is not the case, in which sense do you say that contradictory Christology is metaphysically neutral? Thank you.
Great. Well, it's great that Dr. Gomez is here. For those who don't know, Susana Gomez's work, she is really a pioneer in contradictory theology, and I think you'll be seeing and hearing more of her work in the future. So I'm grateful for the question. It's true that I say the solution I give is metaphysically neutral. The claim is more accurately put as more metaphysically neutral than its competitors. So I concede the point there. But let me also elaborate just for a few seconds more. What I'm getting at is that the attempt to give a consistent but still complete account of Christ, the one person with divine nature and human nature, is often done by trying to, construct new metaphysical this and that. That's not a bad project. It's just that it's driven by a rejection of the possibility of a contradiction. So we don't have to sort of go to the metaphysical tool shed if we are prepared to accept the reality of the contradiction. There's still going to be a true metaphysics of Christ, no question about it. But the question is, do you need to, tinker with metaphysics in order to consistentize Christ? And I say no. So I hope that helps answer the question, which is excellent.
Thank you so much, Dan. We have a question from Jesus, but he also raised his hand, so I don't know if he wants me to read it or he wants to say it himself.
Well, like you would like, if you want, I can read my question.
Como tú quieras, Jesus.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for this great talk. From my philosophy of logic, it's very important to me the borderline between logic and ontological commitments of logic or our logical systems, yeah? So my question is a so general point to JC or to all participants. In case there is a contradiction between two properties in the same entity, in this case, Christ, what is the most appropriate rationally way out, yeah? In this sense, probably the answer consists in the modeling such a contradiction by means of a system that virtually allows it. But this is a question of expressivity of this logical system, and I don't know how far it offers an answer to what to do with any entity which seems in effect to have contradiction properties. So it is the borderline between logic and ontological commitments of logic. So how you can see, could you say something about this point, please?
I think that was to all participants. I can give my answer quickly, but then I'd be interested in the answer from the others as well. So my own view is that you're right about, suppose that you think a phenomenon is truly described by a contradiction. You're right that the way the theory is going to unfold is going to be a matter of expressive resources of the theory and so on, the expressive resources of the language of the theory. I mean, my own view is that the resources of logical vocabulary are very weak indeed, enough to state the contradiction, but not enough to say anything interesting about it. So the interesting stuff about a contradiction is going to be said by extra logical vocabulary that you're going to have to add as a theorist. Logic isn't going to help you there. So that's sort of the direction of my answer. I hope I'm getting at the question, but I'd be interested to hear from the other participants on the question.
So Maria, Luis, do you want to say something about this very question?
Yeah, something very briefly. As a philosopher of science, the cases that I have studied, what show is that even if you have a formal reconstruction that seems to illustrate the toleration of a contradiction, that doesn't imply or justify that you have any ontological commitment or any more serious commitment towards the entities that are described inconsistently as they are described, meaning as inconsistent. And so in that sense, it seems to me that there have to be a lot of other elements in play in order for us to justify us to be committed to any entity that seems problematically described, not only inconsistencies, but also things that look like extremely partial at its nature or extremely vague or things like that, or even impossible in different senses, not only that involving contradiction. And so that's my only idea, that you cannot move from logical or formal reconstructions of anything to be justified to have any more or stronger commitments towards the descriptions that you get.
Thank you so much, Maria. Luis, do you want to say something? Or do you want me to say something? Luis, perfect.
Both. Yes, my own view is very much like Maria's. I'm very skeptical about all this discussion about the ontological commitments of logics or logical systems. I think all them rest on a misreading of the formalism. We are not reading correctly the model theoretic apparatus. So, but it's a huge discussion. But my 2 cents go there.
That is so not fair, because that was just like verbatim what I was gonna say. It is. I think this is based on a mistake of just, we have model theory and we have possible worlds and we have all these points of evaluation, and people think we're doing metaphysics just because of that. But as people who have followed my work know that I don't think that's the right way of understanding model theory. However, so since Luis and Maria played that role, I'm going to have to play a devil's advocate of why people think logic has something to do with metaphysics. Because one can say, okay, how do metaphysicians do their job, right? People who do metaphysics, people who do ontology and want to tell us something about what is there in the world, usually use what I call the master argument, right? The master argument is like, look, people are doing these things, getting along in their lives very well, based on a certain conception of the world. Therefore, that conception of the world should tell us something about how the world is. And you go like, yeah, that sounds fine. But then you have to get to the details about how you go from, for example, from having which is, I'm also repeating a lot of what Maria just said, from a theory that works to reality is like that. And this is a huge gap, right? So you have to fill it with something. And most people think you have to fill it with semantics. And a lot of people also think that a lot of what we call logic is actually just semantics, right? And that, or at least the framework that allows us a certain kind of semantics or another, in such a way that if we have contradiction-tolerant logic, then that is going to result in a semantics that has a different, that presents different constraints to the world in order to make true the propositions that they make true, right? In other words, Luis is right, but we have earned this reputation by using words like truth, right? And truth conditions, because truth conditions are conditions of how the world should be in order for something to be true. So No, Luis? So yeah, I think as long as we keep saying that we can characterize logical operator by talking about truth conditions, we have to recognize that we are trying to say something about what our language tells us about how the world really is. And so it's difficult to avoid ontological commitments. But they are not of the logic, they are of the theories under a logic. Okay, that's my best to try to play devil's advocate. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm the moderator, so I cannot just tune myself out and mute myself. More questions? Otherwise, I have a follow-up to a previous question.
I also have a follow-up, so if you want to go first.
I will.
I will share your follow-up. And if you take too long, I'm just going to say, like, Axel, you're out.
Wunderbar. So this is my follow-up to the first question from YouTube. I forgot the name of the person. I'm so sorry. Leonardo Amado. So what if the conciliary text actually said something like, Christ is not contradictory, is not a contradictory thing? Could we have like a second order contradiction between him being contradictory and him not being contradictory? And then can we just use the same mechanism to resolve this other contradiction, or do we fall in paradox? So that is my question for Beall.
Yeah, that's a good question. So on one hand, I think that the right methodology for the tradition that I'm working in, so there are two matters of authoritative texts that sort of define the true theory. So the first one is Christian scripture. And then, if you're Catholic with a big C, then the councils are secondary, but they are very, very authoritative. So in your written remarks, Axel, you cited Tim Paul, P-A-W-L, and he's very much Catholic with a big C, as is the institution at which I work these days. Okay. So if the conciliar texts said Christ is not a contradiction, or that nothing in Christ is contradictory, or however, make it as explicit as you want. There are a couple things to ask. One, when they say that, are they just affirming it's false that Christ is a contradiction? Because if that's what's being affirmed, they can also affirm that it's true that Christ is a contradiction, although it would be odd not to point that out as well in the context. What they'd probably be saying if they were saying this hypothetical conciliar text, it's probably all Christians should reject that Christ is contradictory. And then that would be, that's sort of the end of the matter for all Catholics. In the Protestant tradition, which is my own tradition, that wouldn't be sufficient, but it would be telling. And one would then have to go back and say, why be so explicit about that and merely say at the big sort of Chalcedon stamp, right, that Christ is one person, fully divine, fully human. Why not say more there? Why be so explicit about the contradiction? But in fact, none of these traditions have stamped an orthodox account of logic or an orthodox account of metaphysics or anything like that. The Catholic tradition relies on Aquinas and relies on Aristotelian metaphysics a lot, but there's no stamp of what the truth is there. Anyway, I think I've said enough to sort of, so on one hand, depending on how this conciliar text is done, you could have a meta contradiction, as you were saying, but there'd be another way of doing it where If those texts are highly authoritative as they are in the Catholic tradition, then this would be gone. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very helpful. María Martínez Ordaz, por favor.
Thank you. So I just wanted to press the point on where can we go from this analysis, and I wanted you to say a bit more about what do you think we can infer from people for instance, not entailing everything from the theory and things like that, because to me it seems that you can explain it two ways. You can say there is something like in a strong sense a paraconsistent type of mechanism that is closer to logic, and in another sense you can say something that it's like there is a mechanism that allows us to move the information. So chunk and permeate. Chunk and permeate is called a paraconsistent reasoning strategy, but doesn't necessarily commit you to paraconsistency, right? And so in the long run, what chunk and permeate does is to preserve consistency at its best. And in that sense, if we have something like that underlying our use of the information regarding Christ, that might support the idea that at least the contradictions that we have about Christ are not true, even if they are legitimate, but they are not true. So I wanted to know if you have any ideas on this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I should flag that I'm not sure when the official end of the session is, but I only have 10 minutes max at this point. And I'm sorry if I misunderstood. Okay. Great question, Maria. One thought that jumps out is chunk and permeate. If you were to try to follow the chunk and permeate program of how to reason, and this is the Bryson Brown, and Graham was in on it a bit, I guess, at some point. Okay, Graham Priest. I think you might run into heresies in this particular domain. I think. I'm not claiming you would, but the details there would really matter. So I worry about sort of the issue of sort of separating out, like resolving the contradiction by separating out parts in ways that might be problematic. I'm not saying they will be, but that would have to be looked at carefully for that program. Okay, but your general point, it wasn't, hey, let's just take this and apply it, then what? Your general point is a good one about following the sort of Brown Priest chunk permeate program and letting that guide our reasoning. Won't that sort of take us away from the contradiction? I think it's going to come down to the details of the case. I mean, what I agree with you, here's where we agree very, very firmly, that the right way to reason about a phenomenon and the right way to build a theory, whether it's contradictory or not, is non-monotonic, unlike logic, and it's going to be complicated, unlike logic, which is like so crazy simple that it's, of course it's not going to help you a whole lot. It's going to constrain your theory. It's going to give you the widest space of possibilities, contrary to what Lewis said. But the actual right description of how we should reason in the face of apparent contradiction, I have no hope that there's a general rule that's both true and important. So you might get a true one. A general rule that's both true and useful. That's what I think. I'm skeptical of. I still feel like I haven't answered your question, Maria, but it feels like every time I've visited UNAM in the past, you ask me a question that's I've never thought about, and so I wind up saying goodbye before answering it.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, since we don't have any further questions, as far as I can see, I just want to take these last few seconds of the transmission just to thank everybody who attended, and of course of the organizers, Luis, Maria. Yeah, right, you're the organizers, right? No, not just Maria. Okay, sorry. No, also not. Okay, anyway.
No, Luis and I.
Okay.
But especially Luis. Okay.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Professor Beall, for virtually visiting Mexico once again. This is your home, you know, and of course for writing this book. And Luis wants to say something.
Yes. The first time you were here in Mexico, JC, you promised to give a talk on analytic demonology. You still owe us that.
Wait, I promised to give a talk on what?
Analytic demonology.
Oh, I did? Okay.
You did.
Well, okay. I will do that. That promise is good.
In Spanish. Now you have to combine your commitments. So now it's going to be in Spanish.
Hold on. I'll say it. I'll say something in Spanish. I was about to say ciao. That's Italian. Hold on. Hola, Maria. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. This has been tremendous. Your interaction with this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a real flag of why I like UNAM's Institute so much, is that it doesn't matter the topic or the project. If it's clear and interesting, you engage and you improve it. And that's a real tribute to you guys. So thank you. Okay. So I got to run. I'll see you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.